All right. Well, this is going to be an interesting subject. Gentlemen, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast. What is this, episode number 242 or something like that? And I'm here with Paul and Phillip Collins. And they have a busy work schedule, and they've been kind enough to come out of their rest to do a show. And so, welcome, Collins Brothers. Do you mind if I call you that?
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's what everybody seems to.
All right.
Yeah.
Are you both twins or?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
we
okay.
sure are.
Right.
All right. So you two are sort of connected at the hip in some way, huh?
Yeah.
Not conjoined.
Yeah. Well, I was being a little sarcastic. Connected otherwise,
Right.
All right. So, well, the reason why I wanted to have you on is to discuss an article that I hadn't seen before. I don't think I had ever come across your work before, but somebody had emailed me your article recently, Blackmailed by the Bomb, Nuclear Anxiety and the Cult of the Superweapon. And so I wanted to have you both on to discuss your article and dive in. So why don't we start off first, Paul, have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I have a degree in liberal studies with a minor in political science. As far as the deep political research that I do, I first became involved in that back when I was about 17 years old. I really started to take off in that field, however, when I was about 22 years old. I had a constitutional law teacher at the time that was also a judge in the area back in Springfield, Ohio, who had done work with the Central Intelligence Agency when he was with the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and he was telling me all of the different stories of different things that he had been through, the minor role that he had played in the Plumbers, and that really got me set off on looking into the sub-rosa level of politics. Really didn't start to publish anything until around 2001, shortly after the attacks on the United States, and that's when I started to publish articles online, and shortly thereafter we became involved with associated with Michael Corbin, the deceased radio talk show host out of Colorado, just south of us. Had a nice long stint with him, a nice long run until about 2000 and 2008 when Michael passed away. And yeah, you can find the majority of our work, an almost complete corpus of our work at conspiracyarchive.com. We've been publishing with Terry Melanson, gosh, since 2004, 2003, probably a little bit even earlier than that.
It was a little earlier than that.
And everything. The author, he's the author of the book, The Perfectibilist, which is probably the best book over the Bavarian Illuminati that's been published next to Fire in the Hearts of Men by James Dillon. Well, Fire in the Hearts of Men.
That's published by Trine Day, correct?
Correct.
And then Chris Milligan's father, Chris Milligan, who owns Trine Day, his father actually ran the entire Pacific Front for the CIA. So here we already have another CIA connection for all of that. So, all right, Phillip, do you want to give us a little detail about your background?
Yeah, sure. I'll make it short and painless. I have a bachelor's degree in communication studies with an emphasis on print journalism and media criticism. I studied semiotics and media analysis and put that to work, of course, in the field of journalism. And I also have a bachelor's degree in liberal studies with an emphasis on literature, and then I have had a philosophy minor. I worked for 4 years as a professional journalist, and I garnered several accolades in that time frame. I got a Osmond C. Hooper Award for Best Photography. I also received another Osmond C. Hooper Award for in-depth reporting, and that was for my work that I did over the Maria Lauterbach case, which I don't know if that's fresh in anybody's memory now, but it did gain the attention of major media organs at the time, and that was the case of a Marine by the name of Maria Lauterbach, who was murdered at Camp Lejeune by allegedly a gentleman by the name of Cesar Lorian, and he fled to Mexico, but he was eventually captured. And this entire affair led to DOD reforms concerning rape and sexual assault, and I got to cover that. Actually, there might have been a deeper story there because at the time we received reports from other fathers of other Marines concerning a possible informal fraternity of Marines who were enjoying the protection of their supervisors of the hierarchy there at Camp Lejeune, and were behaving quite badly and everything. But unfortunately, my editor dropped the ball on that story. She basically didn't follow up and didn't give me any of the information. So who knows where that rabbit hole would have led. But at any rate, it was a very good run as a journalist. And then by 2011, because I had met my future wife and there just was no money to be made in journalism, I finally had to call it quits in terms of that career, and I went to work for the Wyoming Department of Corrections. I work at a female correctional institution now, and I actually gained the distinction of employee of the quarter there in 2013, I believe it was 2013 or 2014. But yeah, so it's been an interesting
from journalist to prison guard, huh?
Yeah.
You're
exactly.
both prison guards now, or interesting.
Yeah, both. That was one thing I left out. We both worked as journalists for the same company for Times Community News. I worked for about 4 years, and you worked for about 5 years with Times Community News as journalists, and so we don't just talk out of our hat when we do a lot of these articles.
So you both did journalism. You're both prison guards. All right, so that's pretty
followed
funny.
The same trajectory.
Right, that's funny. All right, so let's dive into your article here, and you start off with Benazir Bhutto's assassination in Pakistan, and you state that was apparently a hit squad put out by Dick Cheney. So why don't we start off from there, and we'll just dive through point by point through your article, and we'll try and wrap it up in about an hour and a half here.
Sounds good. We started by analyzing an article that came out by Seymour Hersh, who is a very noted journalist. Most people would probably know him because of his work on the My Lai massacre way back in the day. He had basically put forward this contention that Benazir Bhutto had been killed by a death squad that had been formed by Dick Cheney, and it was headed by General Stanley McChrystal, who at that time was the commander of U.S. Army in Afghanistan. He had just recently been appointed at that time. And Cheney was basically using his position as the chief of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, to basically get rid of all the competition that the CIA had in Pakistan. And Hersh had contended in the article. Well, his speculation was that what had led to this assassination was Benazir Bhutto expressing her opinion that Osama bin Laden had been assassinated by Omar Saeed Sheikh. And that could very well have been the reason, but we found that there was probably a deeper sub rosa level to the assassination that centered around the fact that that Benazir Bhutto had made it clear that if she were to ascend to power in Pakistan again, then she was going to allow IEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to actually speak to the infamous metallurgist A.Q. Khan, Abdul Qadir Khan, who had started the nuclear black market that led to the rise of what's been termed the Islamic bomb, that helped the Pakistanis procure a nuclear weapon. Basically in their contest against India, the long running feud, of course, with India is well noted and everything. That's we believe that it probably had something to do with her attempting to allow them access to the Khan so that she could find out more about the Khan network. Elites here in the United States would definitely not have wanted that, because there has been a long-running symbiotic relationship between deviant elites and criminalized intelligence circles here in the United States and this network and the nuclear network. The Khan's network received protection from intelligence here in the United States, and the intelligence circles here in the United States were largely responsible for the rise of the Khan network.
Yeah, that genesis finds its proximate origin with a alliance between Saudi elites and American elites known as the Safari Club, and basically the Saudi Arabia had supplanted Israel as the CIA's source of regional intelligence until Saudi Arabia stepped in and assumed control over
in your article, you talk about James Jesus Angleton, and you say that the CIA resented his relationship with Israel. But wasn't he both OSS and CIA, and wasn't he directly under Allen Dulles? He was.
Correct.
All right. And then he also ran Operation 40 in the Bay of Pigs, Operation Chaos, and appears to have helped organize the assassination of JFK as well.
Very dirty man.
Right.
As a matter
well,
of fact,
I was just going to say, when you were talking about corruption and crime in the intelligence community, I was kind of saying, isn't that kind of redundant,
Yeah. I remember a few years ago, I interviewed James Rothstein, Jim Rothstein, who was an NYPD vice detective, and then went on to have a very famous career also as a private investigator. He worked as a legal consultant to Michael Corbin's A Closer Look show, and he spoke a lot about Angleton. And I remember I was speaking to him, and I said, well, you seem to say that he had his hands in a lot of different pies. And I remember Jimmy just said he's like, that was the most evil man who ever lived. You believe everything you ever hear about that man.
I think I've found a few more evil than him, actually. But I sent you an article. I don't know if you either of you had a chance to read it, but I sent you an article a couple days ago. Did you have a chance to look at it?
Not just yet.
Okay.
What?
It's an article called Spies in Academic Clothing. It's some of my own research that exposes some of the intelligence community's corruption here in the United States with... anyway, you'll have to check that out.
I will definitely read it. Especially
it overlaps a little bit with your work, because what I have found is that in every one of these major social engineering operations that I've investigated, one of the Huxleys was behind it, if not more of them.
Gotcha.
And so just like you cite both, Thomas Henry Huxley, and I think you cite, or is it only Thomas you cite? But anyway, and we can go into this more, but Thomas Henry Huxley was H.G. Wells' teacher, and then and then H.G. Wells taught Aldous Huxley, and Aldous Huxley was, I would argue, he was probably more nasty and dirty and evil than Angleton. Aldous Huxley, he was one corrupt SOB, you know.
Right. It's one big race to the bottom. I know that with Angleton. That with Angleton, you brought him up in regards to the JFK assassination. There was a internal, the head of, I believe he was the head of internal security at the State Department, Otto Otepka. When Otto Otepka was seeking information concerning Oswald and was inquiring with the CIA as to whether or not Oswald was a possible fake defector, and just was trying to find out if he was, under a CIA cover when he went.
Sure, yeah. Well, we know that he was CIA, and his buddy George de Mohrenschildt, we know was CIA, and when George de Mohrenschildt was so-called suicided, he was found with R. Gordon Wasson and George Bush Sr.'s phone numbers in his pocket.
Right.
R. Gordon Wasson worked with Aldous Huxley. He's the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, and both of them were heavily involved in the CIA's MKUltra program. But I think that, we already know that Lee Harvey Oswald, who was also Alex Hadell, was U.S. Marine Corps, and I do have him connected directly to the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was working with, Abe Zapruder was behind all that. If you look into the whole Nardi's connection and everything, they're all working for Nardi's of Dallas, and Jackie is wearing a Nardi's dress when they assassinate, all of this stuff. So there's a lot of good connections there. Now, I've spoke just very quickly, and I'll leave it to you. I spoke, or attempted to speak 9 or 10 different times with Judy Very Baker, who was Oswald's lover or mistress. And she has skated and refused to answer my questions no less than 9 times if she was ever with Oswald when he, and did she ever meet R. Gordon Wasson, because obviously Oswald was close friends with George de Mohrenschildt, who Wasson worked directly with, and she has skated that question no less than 9 times when I've asked her.
Very curious indeed. Very curious. I have yet to pick up Miss Baker's book, Lee and Me, but I have read some of her stuff and everything. And
maybe she was another active counterintelligence. The CIA loves to control the conversation and stuff like this.
Yeah. Some of what she said before in the past I've seen is a little bit cagey, is the best way that I could probably describe it. She's
guarded,
very
cagey, misleading.
Yeah, but with James Jesus Angleton, when Otto Otepka requested this information, that request went past the desk of counterintelligence at the CIA, which was Angleton's desk, which means that he probably played some kind of role as a handler with Oswald. But once Otto Otepka began looking into that, that's really when trouble started for him. He attributed his downfall and in his expulsion from the State Department to his denying the Kennedys their request to bring Walt Rostow into the administration. But I personally think, it's my personal conviction, that it was probably his inquiries into the Kennedy assassination and his running afoul of Angleton that probably was the primary reason for his expulsion. But at the time that the Safari Club was rising up, a pro-Saudi faction of the CIA was taking over under George Bush's watch, and that was around the time that Angleton is getting pushed out of counterintelligence, and he's the Israeli partisan in the CIA, and so the CIA is basically pushing the Israeli partisans to one side and allowing the Saudi partisans in to basically control things. I gotta also say, James Jesus at Angleton was probably not he probably was not a sincere Zionist, or it wasn't his own personal conviction, his Israeli partisanship. He was probably being blackmailed into that. One individual who has contended that that's the case would be John Loftus, that Israel was using his background with fascism.
Well, I'm going to interject there that I personally don't find Loftus to be all that credible. And of course, he was intelligence also. He's also got galactic clearance, and he was the former chief prosecutor for the Carter and Reagan administrations. So he wouldn't really have any reason to. And I've interviewed him, but he really, in my opinion, would have actually plenty. I was going to be sarcastic. He would have plenty of reason to misstate things, I think.
Yeah. There's lots of little nuggets of truth in the secret war against the Jews, his book and all. But when you come across a section in this book that says, well, the National Security Council screened out all drug dealers and weapons dealers when finding somebody for the Iran-Contra operation, then all of a sudden red lights start to...
Oh, sure. Well, and he denied on my show the CIA's involvement with the drug trade and everything, and I've got about... I've got a database where I track these people, and I've got a couple of hundred of CIA agents that were involved in the drug trade. And in fact, Timothy Leary, the famous guru of the psychedelic 60s, admitted 2 different times that he was an agent. He admitted that he was a witting agent by 62.
Range. There were more doctors involved, there were more scientists involved.
We had Gerald and Aldous.
Yes, right, yeah. And Ivan, of course. Then, of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Well, you might not call it a cell, let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country paying.
Yeah, and then Zinberg says that the...
So, it's definitely hard to believe him. And then Larry, Aldous Huxley promoting the drugs. Right. He was CIA and MI6, et cetera. So, we've got to take that stuff with a grain of salt, especially coming from the White House and the intelligence community. Now, I've got a quote here I want to read you from Frances Stonner Saunders' book, and she says, "The key to all of this is the counterpart funds. Lawrence de Neufville later revealed people couldn't say in the U.S. Congress, quote, 'Oh, look what they're doing with taxpayers' money,' because it wasn't it wasn't our money. It was a byproduct of the Marshall Plan, and an innovative move under the early years of the Marshall Plan. It was proposed that, in order to make funds perform double duty, each recipient country should contribute to a foreign aid effort by depositing an amount equal to the U.S. contribution in its central bank. A bilateral agreement between the country and the U.S. allowed these funds to be used jointly. The bulk of the currency funds, 95%, remained the legal property of the country's government, while 5% became, upon deposit, the property of the U.S. government. These property funds, a secret fund roughly $200 million a year, were made available as the secret war chest for the CIA. Now, Irving Browning was also able to boost his CIA slush fund with Marshall Plan candy."
Yeah, that's exactly what Stoddard is describing there. That's exactly what we see with the Safari Club, is the kind of slush fund that is set up to continue with covert operations at a time when scrutiny was very heavy. See, around 1973, we have the end of America's ground involvement in Vietnam. And then around, I think it was about 75, the fall of Saigon happens. 76, we have the infamous Year of Intelligence. And this is when The church committee was starting to look into into abuses by the CIA.
the MK Ultra program,
Yeah.
etc. And that's what the article exposes that I sent you before, that they misled and controlled the entire conversation regarding that.
Yeah. See, and at this time, so all of this light is being shined on all of these different covert operations. The elite, America's semi-submerged oligarchy begins going back and forth, trying to blame one another. You got the Southern Rim guys start trying and the fighting with the Atlanticists and both of them trying to blame one another for the debacle that was Vietnam, as people got the smell of Vietnam and realized that they had probably been hoodwinked into an unnecessary war. And the purse strings were really pulled tight by Congress. They were not going to allocate a penny to covert operations anywhere in the world. So the Safari Club, primarily the Saudis in the Safari Club, stepped forward and said, we'll take over financing for the intelligence community and everything. So the Saudi royals basically became the financier of CIA covert operations. And one of those operations was basically the formation of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and financing those anti-Kabul rebels over there to make all sorts of havoc and to basically incite trouble with the pro-Soviet regime that was in Kabul.
Now, that would include the creation of Al-Qaeda, which means database. And,
it would eventually.
And to Loftus's credit, he did admit on my show that the U.S. government did entirely create Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, absolutely. But what they were trying to do was they were trying to entice the Soviets into coming over to Afghanistan and into fighting a war over in Afghanistan, which would be the equivalent of their Vietnam. And behind this plan, one of the primary architects behind this plan was Zbigniew Brzezinski himself, a person with several different intelligence connections. He was probably Ted Shackley's one of his assets during his days in college.
Now, wouldn't he be another connection as another Zionist into Israeli intelligence as well?
I've never looked at him as such. I mean, I know that when Israel was looking at conducting airstrikes into Iran, he was suggesting that any attempts to do so should lead to Americans.
I've always seen Brzezinski as a staunch, devout Zionist. So, let me ask you what. And you've mentioned the Safari Club a couple of times already. What was the Safari Club?
It was basically a coalition of people from France, Germany, America, Saudi Arabia, a few other countries.
Egypt and Morocco.
Yeah, Egypt, Morocco were involved, and
Iran.
Yeah, and Iran, and it was kind of a private intelligence consortium that involved elites from all these different countries and the American elite too. And what it basically became was a kind of conduit for financing of covert operations during a time when the intelligence community here in the West just couldn't get the money because Congress was just dead set against allowing for covert operations anywhere in the world because of all these revelations coming out, both foreign, whether it was Vietnam and the Vietnam debacle, or domestic, because around '74 we had a lot of revelations concerning Watergate and the intelligence connections that ran deep into the plumbers group there. So it's basically it's essentially the privatization of intelligence and of intelligence work. That's what you can see the Safari Club as the embodiment of.
All right, and there's probably several dozen other organizations that act as in a similar fashion as well, that interact and work along with the CIA and other intelligence agencies. All right, let's talk about the creation of enemies using the Hegelian dialectic.
Okay. Well, around 1978, what they did was they started to finance Islamic fighters that were against the pro-Soviet government in Kabul, and the reason for doing this was Robert Gates has come forward and admitted this, and Brzezinski came forward and admitted to this in a French publication. The whole purpose of doing this was to basically entice the Soviets to go over to Afghanistan and get involved in their own quagmire that was not all too unlike the Soviet Union. There had already been some contention over there for the Soviet Union, which suggested to the American elites that they could be pulled into a war over in Afghanistan. I mean, you had Daoud being removed by Taraki. Taraki was pro-Soviet and tried to basically Sovietize the country, and then then he's removed, and there's just all this back and forth between Western and Soviet proxies there. And so you can see where the Soviet Union is starting to feel the pressure to become directly involved in the situation. And again, like as you said, this was part of the maintenance of that whole dialectical rivalry between the East and the West. America had experienced their Vietnam. They had experienced their fall in morale, their crushing defeat. It was now time for the Soviet Union to experience theirs, and so they began to get these Islamic fighters to just raise all sorts of hell for the government in Kabul, and basically put this pressure on the Soviet Union to go into Kabul, and they thought it would be an enticement, and in retrospect they were right, because the Soviets did invade Afghanistan.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it was at that time that Brzezinski flew over and spoke to some of the freedom fighters.
Yeah, he actually went over and made a now famous speech where he said, "God is on your side."
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day, because your fight will prevail, and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again, because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis would be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as
So
long.
you have the perpetuation there of this Manichaean binary, where of course corruption, the evil, the proverbial forces of darkness is projected onto the East. Now the Soviet Union becomes the evil empire. Forget for the moment the dialectical commonalities that render that binary opposition absolutely superfluous, because America was in essence doing some of the very same things, if not worse.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
I mean, and on that, note, as far those commonalities actually led to the emergence of symbiosis periodically during the Cold War period of history, because there were both hawks and the East and the West that saw that it was more profitable to prolong this period of Cold War and whenever there was a thaw started to be experienced, and there was a thawing and warmer diplomatic relations, we've seen factions in both the East and the West actually coming together, convergence of forces periodically to prevent that thaw, and to frustrate things so that it could be prolonged for a number of reasons. The defense contractors here in the United States were making money hand over fist. The defense establishment over in the Soviet Union was prospering. There were and also the longer that you drew this out, the longer you were going to be able to generate what we call in the article nuclear anxiety, the fear of nuclear extinction, both in the East and the West.
Sure. Now, let me ask you this: have you read Douglas Reed's book that discusses how the U.S. funded and propped up the Soviet Union to create that dialectic?
No, I can't say that I have. I can't say that I have. Did Reed? Is he the one that did the work with over Heinrich Mueller?
It's been several years since I've read the book. I don't recall exactly.
Okay, all right. Because I think I recognize Douglas Reed as the individual who did the book over the interrogations of Heinrich Mueller, and I know that he shared with Joseph Trinto. Or he claims to have shared with Joseph Trinto a relationship with one intelligence figure, Crowley, and Trinto. His work we cited extensively in our article.
Which Crowley?
Well, not Aleister Crowley. I believe his name was.
Yeah, Aleister Crowley was MI6 too. So
no, I believe his name was Robert Crowley. Initially, he got pissed off at Trinto for exposing the role that he played in the fall of Allende and the rise of Pinochet over in Chile, but eventually they became friends, and that led to a series of interviews between Joe Trinto and Crowley, and a lot of what Crowley told Trinto ended up in the book Prelude to Terror, and I think a little bit of it actually ended up in his book Secret History of the CIA too. And I think that Douglas Reed shared Crowley
if we're talking about the same person, I'm not sure.
If we're talking about the same person, if we are, I've always treated Reed with if this is the same Reed, I've always treated him with a grain of salt just because of his association to Liberty Lobby and Willis Garfield.
It might be different because he's got the one I'm talking about. He's got a lot of primary citations in his book. But let's jump over to the Con Network. What was it, and what did it attempt to do?
Okay, well, in 1979, Brzezinski presented Carter with this memo, where he said that if they were successful, if the Americans were successful in pulling the Soviets into Afghanistan and getting this invasion going, and America, then begins to finance the so-called freedom fighters over there and all, the whole effort would actually lead to it could lead to nuclear proliferation because money that was going through all the Muslims were being brought over to that area of the world at that time. But before going to Afghanistan, they're going over to Peshawar, and they're using Pakistan as kind of a launch pad for the covert war that's going on in Afghanistan. And that means that a lot of the money is going through Pakistani ISI, their intelligence group, which I would basically refer to as the prostitutes of the CIA.
Right. That sounds about right.
Yeah, I could use a lot stronger term, but I'm going to spare the audience. And what the ISI would do, and Brzezinski knows this. He knew this was going to happen. They're going to siphon off money for that covert effort. And instead of placing it all in the Mujahideen and in the Mujahideen's attempts to destabilize Russia, the Soviet invasion, they're going to put a lot of that money into their own efforts to procure a nuclear weapon. So Brzezinski basically says to Carter, look, we follow this course of action, and it will lead to a crushing defeat for the Soviet Union and all, but we'll also have to abandon any attempts to prevent nuclear proliferation on the part of Pakistan. And I believe that it's well worth the stretch. And, that's what he basically says with this. So a lot of that money starts being siphoned off. It starts going to a now famous metallurgist, A.Q. Khan, as he begins to work on developing a bomb that would basically put them on parity with their dreaded enemies, the Indians, because of just that well-known rivalry that we've had forever and a day between India and Pakistan. And in the article, we make it clear that we believe that Carter was just a puppet of people like Brzezinski, just the whole trilateral group, the Trilateral Commission, and we point out that Hamilton Jordan, who was his campaign advisor, Carter's campaign advisor, he had said after the election and after Carter's rise to power that if after that election you saw Zbigniew Brzezinski as the national security advisor, and then they failed. They failed to be the anti-establishment administration that they claimed they would be.
He also promised that he would quit,
but he didn't. He didn't. Yeah, he didn't quit, but he promised that that he would. Carter did do some good things to try to become that kind of anti-establishment candidate that he had promised America that he would be. For instance, the Halloween massacre. He and his friend from the Navy went into CIA. Stansfield Turner. He put Stansfield Turner in as the DCI, and they fired a lot of these covert operatives. A lot of the CIA's covert operatives, and just induced a lot of wrath from the covert side of the Central Intelligence Agency. But on the Afghanistan issue, he proved to be completely spineless, because he should have said to Brzezinski, well, if we're going to have to abandon our counter-proliferation efforts with Pakistan, just to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, forget it. And besides that, we'll be fighting a covert war. We'll be fighting a dirty war over there. And that's one of the things that I ran on the platform of cleaning house with the intelligence community. And so he basically, it was just one more of those instances where somebody promised something on their path to the presidency, and then when they got there, reneged and everything. So and also I'd like to point out that Brzezinski, again, he had a very dubious connection to the intelligence community. He was working in the CIA's. He was working. It looks like he was, as a student, when he was a young Polish student. He was working for Ted Shackley when Ted Shackley was the CIA's East Europe. Was when he was with the East Europe division. And Ted Shackley was basically he was at the center of all things related to covert operations with the CIA. I mean, he was the head of the Directorate of Operations with his assistant Tom Kleins and everything. But Shackley Shackley was also involved with an individual by the name of Edwin Wilson, and there's a long story there too that's worth going into. But suffice it to say right now that Edwin Wilson was the individual that they turned to create a private intelligence network, which included the Safari Club. Wilson was an associate of another Wilson, not of relation to him, Congressman Charles Wilson, and they brought Charlie Wilson in of the Charlie Wilson's War fame to work with the CIA in congressional efforts to basically get congressional support for our efforts over in Afghanistan.
All right, let's talk about whistleblowers. And you mentioned in your article that there have been several that have had their careers destroyed trying to expose all of this. You want to talk about that?
Well, one of the individuals that tried to deal with this situation and bring it to life was a British customs agent who had basically come across the AQ-Con network and was trying to and was basically passing information to his handlers in the in intelligence. And
how do you pronounce his name? Atif Amin?
Yeah, Atif Amin. And as a result of this of him trying to expose this effort, the guns were turned on him. Another individual who was involved was Richard Barlow. He had found out about America being involved with the Con network. That poor man, he no longer works for the Central Intelligence Agency. Last time I heard, he's living in a trailer now, and probably the biggest one was Valerie Plame. Valerie Plame was part of a CIA counterproliferation group that was working out of a firm known as Brewster's Jennings. And Brewster Jennings was basically her cover, and needless to say, her cover when she began to close in on the AQ-Con network, her cover was blown. I mean, it basically was shown in the it came out in the United States press. She was outed as a CIA operative. Another individual who started to come across the Con network was, of course, also Sibel Edmonds, and she was a translator for the FBI, and she had come across the Turkish connections there because Turkey was involved in the finance of Con's network.
Now,
and,
you had found that there was both British and American complicity, or these people have found that there was British and American complicity in the Con network?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that both British and American intelligence were involved in the Con network. And in Edmonds' case, it led to, when she tried to get all of this out, it led to the Attorney General at the time, John Ashcroft, imposing a state secrets gag order on her. And she spent a lot of time not being able to speak about any of this. And, when we look for motives, why did they basically put Barlow's, career in the toilet? Why was Sibel Edmonds forced out of the FBI? We see there's a lot of economic determinism there. Because there was a lot of money that people would lose. A lot of people were making money hand over fist through that black market. But and you can certainly see where following the money helps you to begin to put together the pieces. But what a lot of people have failed to recognize, investigative journalist Joe Trento among them, is that money is merely a means to an end, and that there's deeper ideological motivations for world events that you have to bleach out when you're reaching your final conclusion, and money is basically just a way of gauging the success in realizing your ideological goals. And with the con network, basically what we seen was it was proliferation that was aimed at conditioning the population of not just the United States but the world in general, conditioning them with what we call nuclear anxiety. I mean,
Sure.
just imposing the fear of nuclear extinction upon the whole of planet Earth in order to blackmail people into accepting a world government as the alternative to
Right.
nuclear extinction.
Now, and I wanted to ask you. You state that the nuclear proliferation was no accidental occurrence either. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, you go back all the way to George Racy Jordan when he was handling the Lend-Lease program at Great Falls at the Great Falls Air Force Base, and he's finding all of this material. He's heavy water, atoms, all of this stuff, all these documents and these components going over to the Soviet Union from the United States that when put together would make a nuclear weapon. And he tries to bring this out, and he tried to expose this and faced a lot of ridicule and trouble for it as well, because he's basically finding that individuals like Harry Hopkins, like Alger Hiss, individuals involved in the Roosevelt administration are aiding the Soviet Union in procuring a bomb.
As a matter of fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but what wasn't one of the documents that he found addressed to Hiss?
It said from Hiss on it.
Yeah.
And I'd like to just point out that we don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of Hiss at that time being a Soviet agent. We believe that he probably was he was most certainly a Soviet agent. Prior to that time, he was part of the, I want to say the Silver Master cell here in the United States, but the Silver Master cell had long broke up after there was a purge in the Soviet Union. Roosevelt probably turned to Hiss because of Hiss's pro-Soviet tilt, and was using Hiss as one of the globalist liaisons, one of the liaisons between the Western globalists and the Soviet elites. And we're not the only ones to suggest this. Pavel Doplatov suggested it in his work as well.
You'll have to forgive the noise in the background here, and I am getting a thunderstorm right now in the middle of a snowstorm that'll hit you in about 6 hours, apparently. And since I'm in Southern California. And also, we're still having trouble with your microphone. I'll have to try and clean it out after the recording. But your microphone sounds pretty bad. You guys might want to look into that for future interviews and things. You had mentioned that they use the threat of extinction to promote world governance and the New World Order. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Who created the term New World Order?
Well, that goes back several years.
Yeah.
It was originated by, ironically, H.G. Wells.
Popularized
and then he wrote a book called The New World Order, and then Huxley, who is of course his student, followed up with A Brave New World, which is what we see a lot of going on right now. But so this New World Order idea, it actually, and Wells, and we'll get back to him here in a few minutes, but that sort of manifests all of this stuff actually comes from Wells and the Huxleys that we're getting to here. Now, what did you find on Theodore Adorno and his identification of disjunction between the scientific progress and social progress?
Well, Theodore Adorno, one of the observations he made
and he's not the only theoretician to have made this observation, was that social progress was not necessarily commensurate with technological and scientific progress. The problem with that idea is that supposedly the more that technological and scientific advancements are made, the more that the human condition and social conditions will follow suit. In other words, the better the technology, the better the science, the better that humanity's overall state of affairs will be. And this is just a baseless utopian notion. It's founded on progressivism, which basically held that there was this deeply embedded teleological principle within the cosmos that was driving human history on this upward trajectory towards better and brighter things. But clearly, that's not proven to be the case.
especially when you get the Huxleys involved in something.
Right. Exactly. You see progressivism and this notion of this upward trajectory. You see it being reiterated in various forms. You mentioned earlier the Hegelian dialectic. George Friedrich Hegel was one of those theoreticians who distilled progressivism as the dialectic of history, this notion that things would become better and better and better. But as we can see, as is evidenced by technological and scientific advancements with nuclear weapons.
I think if we think of it in terms of the elite psychopath, and we see a lot of this, and I've studied a lot of their backgrounds and their relations to eugenics, etc. If we see that their idea of utopian progressivism as a form of eugenics and getting rid of everybody else, then maybe we can see it like that, because they have to create all this discord and degeneracy and everything that they sell onto society, which then pushes everybody else down. Essentially, they're not able to elevate themselves without pushing everyone else down. That would be the shortest way I could describe it.
Right. And with thinkers such as Hegel and whose ideas, of course, would heavily influence Karl Marx. Karl Marx would refine Hegel's ideas as dialectical materialism, and that would basically redirect the dialectic towards the realm of socioeconomics, out of which you would have the emergence of this binary opposition of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and then you see the further promulgation of more and more binary oppositions, East versus West, the Soviet Union versus America, and what have you.
You see with the neocons where they simply changed the groups that were involved from the proletariat to the middle class,
right?
And then so you basically still saw the.
So you see history being driven by a series of binary oppositions, where these
thesis, antithesis, synthesis,
right.
repeat.
Yeah, these irreconcilable antagonisms that are never resolved adequately. Instead, they lead to a synthesis, which is really just a combination of the worst features of both.
Right. Yeah, it's a great big middle of the road fallacy, essentially.
Right.
You
know. And that's all because if you trace back Hegel's ideological heritage, he came out of the Romanticist movement, and the Romanticists basically were putting their own interpretive spin on what could be called process theology or reabsorption theology. That's one of the neologisms that Murray Rothbard has assigned it. But basically, this was
this was a new Gnostic idealism that arose from the work of Jakob Boehm. What Jakob Boehm did was, of course, with Gnosticism, the ancient Gnosticism, the belief that the descent into materiality, the physical cosmos, all of it was just a horrible mistake.
Sure, and then he's the biggest influence into Emanuel Swedenborg. Emanuel Swedenborg was intelligence for the King of Sweden. That influences the Huxleys. He writes Heaven and Hell. Huxley writes Heaven and Hell. Yada yada yada, straight down the list. So this is the Swedenborg, and from above Swedenborg, you might even go as far as Hassani Sabaz, one of the earlier manifestations of this stuff. But I mean, this handful of people is really the foundation of the intelligence community.
Yeah, the ideological backbone there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, which is basically born of this transposition of Gnosticism's radical metaphysical dualism into the immanent sphere, and with that transposition, you find the introduction of theodical elements that basically soften Gnosticism's original docetistic cosmological attitude, the relatively pessimistic view of the material cosmos. It softens that, and it makes the descent into materiality appear to be a necessary phase during which God, which is supposedly the collective consciousness of humanity itself, so you have this autotheistic view of God, rediscovers itself. And so the dialectic of history must continue on and on till humanity rediscovers its own intrinsic divinity. And that entails bloodshed. That entails
eugenics, like you said.
Eugenics and everything.
Yeah. Well, the psychopaths always have reasons to justify everything they do.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
we should probably switch gears a little bit. But and I kind of already gave this away, but who created the idea of the atomic bomb?
That would be H.G. Wells. And as a matter of fact, he coined the neologism in the book "The World Set Free." And in the book "The World Set Free," he basically presents the atom bomb as the means by which it becomes a veritable rod of correction to be used against the recalcitrant nations. The irony is the entire time he's decrying the evils of war, but then he poses as the prescription yet another evil. The atom bomb, which is the means by which nation states can be forced to surrender their sovereignty.
Well, let me just give you a little bit of background on Wells here. He was, of course, and this is in your article, but he was, of course, a Fabian socialist and into scientism. He's a member of the British Eugenics Society, the Coefficients Club. He is one of the early, and going back to magic mushrooms and Gordon Wasson, he's one of the early magic mushroom discoverers, quote unquote. McCoy's atomic bomb influences John G. Burke, which flows back into that. Of course, you can't influence an Aldous Huxley without influencing a eugenicist like Julian Huxley, so we can't leave out another Huxley there. Of course, he writes The War of the Worlds now for the Hallows Eve episode of this show. I actually went to Princeton, excuse me. You guys go to prison I go to Princeton. So I went to Princeton and investigated the whole the Princeton Radio Project and Orson Welles' relationship with that. So, of course, H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds. That actually is, and I encourage the both of you to watch my episode on that because
Will do.
The episode, the radio show, The War of the Worlds that they put out there, the psychological drama that they were creating wasn't just the episode itself. It was all of the propaganda, even since all the way up to today, that they put out that it caused that psychological trauma. A lot of the propaganda about it is that 1 million people went nuts from that show. Okay,
yeah.
So
I'm definitely going to check out your show on that. One thing I want to point out at this juncture, the article is becoming part of a larger book, and one of the things that we go into is how the cult of the superweapon, which is what Huxley's writings were. I mean, not Huxley. Wells's writings were basically giving rise to, and all this cult of the superweapon among the elite deviants. This cult of the superweapon is eventually going to morph and change into the cult of the UFO when this mythological narrative.
Well, who created the whole idea of the cult of the UFO was H.G. Wells again. So again, we're right back at this.
And if I may add, also, if I'm not mistaken, a Rockefeller study group,
Hadley Cantrell.
Yeah, Hadley Cantrell. Actually published the book over.
All right, so I was just at Princeton researching Hadley Cantrell.
Right.
And may I just say, Princeton was a hotbed for intelligence work.
Absolutely.
If you look at Osmond, the CIA mind control doctor, if I recall correctly, he was out of Princeton.
Well, Humphrey Osmond, he was. I have pegged him as MK Ultra. And of course, he was Aldous Huxley's personal doctor.
Yeah, and then he was also associated with Jose Arguelles. The individual who came up with the whole 2012 eschatology. So
and that was also Professor Michael Coe out of Yale, who wrote that in his 1966 book, The Maya, and it even admits right on Wikipedia that Coe was CIA. And but Hadley Cantrell worked directly, knocking the microphone in my face, worked directly with Dwight Eisenhower. He was the head, and I've gone into the CFR archives, which are held at the Mudd Library in Princeton, and you can see all that stuff right there. But Hadley Cantrell headed the Princeton Radio Project. He worked directly with Alan Dulles, Frank Stanton, who was the head of CBS. Now, Frank Stanton and CBS, they're the ones that popularized the whole UFO thing. So I've been tracking CBS and the whole UFO supposed phenomenon, alien abduction, and just about everywhere throughout the 50s and 60s where supposed UFO abductions and sightings happen, there's CBS. There's, John G. Fuller from CBS and the rest of these guys, etc.
Yeah, in terms of other media organs being involved in that, if you look there back when there was a fever pitch concerning UFOs, you also saw the National Enquirer just popping up here and there with stories about UFOs. With they actually, if I recall correctly, either paid for or volunteered to pay for the polygraph on what's his name behind Fire in the Sky.
Walton. Yeah,
Travis Walton.
Travis Walton.
Paid for his polygraph and all. The National Enquirer was founded by an individual by the name of Generoso Pope. Generoso Pope worked for the Central Intelligence Agency in Korea. And
that's funny. I had totally forgotten about the National Enquirer, but that makes total sense. So now, essentially, the History Channel today would be the National Enquirer of back then, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
How many ancient?
The History Channel, what a misnomer.
Right, the Fantasy Channel. How many ancient aliens documentaries have they had now?
I mean,
that's hilarious.
Recently, the History Channel had their UFO hunters program. Go and look into the background of Dugway Proving Grounds, and basically try to connect it to all sorts of UFO strangeness. But if you look into Dugway Proving Grounds, you find individuals like Lawrence Layton there, who basically became involved in mind control experiments that have been connected to the Jonestown massacre in Guyana.
Well, you know that Jim Jones was intel also. I've tracked his background too, and he goes right into
Dan Mitrione.
Well, see, I have a large database that I use to track these guys. So Jim Jones, of course, he was a Marxist. and heavily influenced also by the Nazis. Joseph Stalin is right there. He was a major feminist, of course. Gloria Steinem admitted that she was CIA. I've got DCI William Colby admitting that she was CIA, but Jim Jones is tied right into the middle of all of this stuff.
Yeah, he's tied right into, and he even goes into things that pertaining to our article because, first of all, we find evidence that he probably formed one of the earliest UFO cults, and UFO cults, whether you're speaking about Heaven's Gate or the Rael group, you find that they're basically intelligence.
Now, what
operations.
I've done is I've created a thing in my database that's MK Ultra cults. Okay, and under MK Ultra cults, I do have Jim Jones listed there, and some of these may surprise you. I've also got some evidence that Alan Watts, the famous hippie philosopher, was CIA. He created the Zen Buddhist double buying cult. Bill Wilson was one of them with Alcoholics Anonymous cult. You guys mentioned L. Ron Hubbard. We can't forget that one. James Lovelock and the Gaia cult. And number 5 is Jim Jones. We've got Michael Murphy and Dick Price with the Esalen cult. Andrea Puharich with the Council of Nine cults. Guy Bannister, UFO cult. Steve Jobs and the Apple cult, and that's starting to get some exposure finally as well. And the big bite out of the apple and the fall of man. Tim Leary, IFIF, Psychedelic Revolution, and Psychedelic Orientalism cults. Farmer John Griggs and the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Allen Ginsberg, again with IFIF, Psychedelic Revolution, Psychedelic Orientalism. We've got Houston Smith, Charles Manson, Albert Hoffman, and the Bicycle Day cult. Albert Hoffman was CIA and French intel. Ram Dass, Be Here Now, and IFIF cults again. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Leary admits straight out that Ken Kesey was an agent. Of course, Gordon Wasson, we've already mentioned. Al Hubbard created the LSD cult. He had exclusive rights to import LSD into the country, which is where the CIA got all of theirs. Carl Ruck at Boston University and the Demeter cult. Margaret Mead and Wilhelm Reich, the sexual liberation cult. And I'm not even halfway through this list, but these are CIA-created cults that I've tracked over the last several years. We even have guys like John Perry Barlow and the Electronic Freedom Foundation, the Grateful Dead cults, etc. So all of these guys tie into this disinformation being put out by the central. I like to call them the Central Entertainment Agency.
And a lot of them play into again this evolution, if you will, of the cult of the superweapon into the cult of the UFO.
Well, and the transhumanism cult. We can't forget that.
Oh yeah, of course.
Right. But I mean, all it is it's basically the ongoing development of what is known as the beyond, the concept of the beyond, the idea of a threat or something that enters into the picture that dwarfs us epistemologically.
Yeah, epistemologically and ontologically, humanity is absolutely overshadowed by these noumenal forces that now impose themselves upon us.
Right. Yeah, it's always about things that you can't prove or can't know, et cetera. They're always promoting all of this mysticism, which is why I constantly state that mysticism is the tool of tyrants. They want to get us all to believe things that we can't know in 5 sense reality, hence the promotion of quantum physics and all of this stuff, and I've done some exposure on that as well. I do have some other points. We've got about 25 minutes left, maybe.
Okay.
So there are some other points here. I want to get into what is Gedanken Experimente.
Oh, Gedanken experiment.
Okay, so excuse my poor German.
Oh no, that's no problem. It took me some time to get that one as well. Basically, Gedanken experiment is German for thought experiment, and what John W. Campbell proposed. John W. Campbell, of course, was the famous sci-fi author. He wrote one of his major works was the short story "Who Goes There," which eventually was made into the film "The Thing" from Another World, and then of course John Carpenter remade it in the 1980s as "The Thing." but he basically proposed that that science fiction could present this unparalleled opportunity for conducting Gedanken experiments. And the way that works, and this is in a essay by a literary scholar by the name of Martha A. Barter. So this is not coming from any conspiracy theorist. This is coming from an actual.
Well, of course, and that term even came from the Rand Corporation.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
and that was to thwart investigation into the JFK assassination. So it's a nice ad hominem, but it doesn't really work.
Right, exactly. It's just this expedient pejorative that they toss out there. But at any rate, what she states is that through the inducement of the willing suspension of disbelief, audiences who are exposed to these sci-fi narratives actually begin to engage in Gedanken experiments. They simultaneously uphold a portion of the status quo while calling another portion of it into question. They start running hypotheticals in their mind of these anticipatory fantasies. And in so doing, that actually gives rise to cultural revisions to the overall cultural paradigm. The cultural milieu begins to shift, and what she cites as an example of a sociocultural Gedanken experiment was none other than the Manhattan Project. Leo Szilard, who was a Hungarian American physicist, read H.G. Wells' The World Set Free, and he actually patterned the Manhattan Project and its compartmentalized organizational framework off of a model presented in The World Set Free.
Yeah,
so,
and I was just going to ask you about that. So how did the Manhattan Project also maintain a high level of secrecy?
Well, one group of scientists would be working on one portion, another group of scientists on another.
Yeah, they basically create, what you see in the intelligence community today, or within academia, you see this as well, these academic cells, and then you get all these bogus academics who cite each other to cover up the larger deal.
The analogy that I like to draw is the story of the individual of the man who worked at a supposed baby buggy factory in Nazi Germany, but he only put together he only manufactured one component, and he was running short on money, so he begins to go around to all the other different departments and secretly collect the other components so that he can have a baby buggy because the wife is pregnant. Well, he brings home all these components and begins to put them together, but he doesn't get a baby buggy, he gets a gun. and that's what we see with compartmentalization.
Right, and that's throughout the academic community now. I got a trick question for you. Who created this compartmentalization within the academic community that we see today?
Who would that be?
You already know the answer, but it's H.G. Wells. Or, geez, now I'm doing what you did. It was Thomas Henry Huxley who did it.
T.H. Huxley.
Yeah, T.H. Huxley. We always go back to that. You can't get away when you're studying mind control and social control. You can't get away from the Huxley clowns. It never. It's always one or two steps and it loops right back into the Huxleys.
Right.
All right. Let's dive in for a moment here into Fabian socialists.
Certainly. Well, H.G. Wells was himself a Fabian socialist, and what the Fabians understood was that socialism, that particular societal model, could probably not be instantiated automatically overnight. And so they adopted a more incremental approach.
Tiptoe totalitarianism approach.
Right. One in which society would be gradually transformed into a socialist society, or as George Bernard Shaw put it, that socialism's really just communism, only better English.
They came up with they came up with the piecemeal strategy that would then be picked up by the by their globalist brothers here in the United States. Because if you look later on, long after Sidney Webb is gone, if you there's an article that comes out in the Council on Foreign Relations journal Foreign Affairs by Richard Gardner, called The Hard Road to World Order, where Gardner says, well, you're not going to get world government with one big frontal assault. You're going to have to do this piecemeal, incrementally, by introducing.
And we see this with the Obama administration, with Cass Sunstein and the whole nudge. You know, they're constantly nudging and doing all of this as well. That's
right.
I'm actually very shocked at how much overlap our work has here. So
yeah, well, two Fabian socialists now. Paul just mentioned one, Sidney Webb, and then of course Beatrice Webb. Those two formed the Coefficients Club, which you mentioned earlier, and H.G. Wells was a member of the Coefficients Club. But the Coefficients Club exhibited this overwhelming preoccupation with war. Many of its members were actually promoting war with Germany well in advance of World War I. One of which being Leo Maxey. As a matter of fact, this preoccupation with war actually just led to the overall disillusionment of one of its members, which was none other than Bertrand Russell. So, to his credit, Bertrand Russell, who
was a Fabian.
Yeah, who was a Fabian and also a eugenicist,
absolutely.
Major proponent of population control. But I guess to his credit, at the very least, he couldn't stomach all the talk of war. God only knows why he could stomach the talk
either that or they just use their own spin to protect themselves. We also see Annie Besant as a Fabian. Aldous Huxley was a Fabian, of course. George Bernard Shaw, George Orwell. You already mentioned H.G. Wells, John Dewey, John Maynard Keynes. The London School of Economics came out of the Fabian Society. We also have the Hegelian dialectic of deception being a major influence of the Hegelian or of the Fabian Society. Tony Blair is another Fabian. So there's a whole bunch of these guys, and when we begin to look at the Fabian influence and people like H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley and Thomas Huxley, etc., we see this whole thing playing out into society. You have John Maynard Keynes, who comes up with the idea of the World Bank, John Dewey, who destroys education and creates all of this dumbing down, etc.
It's interesting that you named among those Annie Besant. Annie Besant was also part of the Theosophical Society.
Absolutely.
That was formed by Madame Helena Blavatsky.
Absolutely.
So that gets back to your point about mysticism.
As the tool of the tyrants,
yeah,
right.
I believe that you think that it was created as a tool. We believe that it was probably co-opted.
I have followed it back and I've studied it for years, and I would have to disagree with you on that. Even if we look at the Dalai Lama has been CIA since the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. He used to pull Tibet away from China.
But the irony of that is that he's an admitted Marxist and communist. Okay, so I mean, he was supposedly fighting against communist China, but he's a communist. So he also goes off into promoting all of this New Age religiosity through the Naropa Institute. Right. The Naropa Institute was actually created by the Greenwich Village team of MKUltra, which included Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, and Allen Ginsberg. Okay, this is the another nexus of the CIA selling this stuff.
But the reason I think it's important to bring it up is because Annie Besant's part of the Theosophical Society of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky fame, and then out of the Theosophical Society, we're going to have the rise of the New Age. And there were several different individuals in the New Age and several different groups in the New Age that were proponents of handing over all the different nations' nuclear arsenals to the United Nations. And so, you're seeing the cult of the superweapon actually reach its apex right there,
Right.
and everything, where they finally realize this goal of a world government that sustains itself through a monopoly on the most lethal force that there is, at least at this particular juncture in human history.
All right, so let's get into Darwinian militarism. Of course, we can't discuss Darwin without discussing Huxley, because Thomas Huxley was Darwin's propaganda manager.
Right.
So I'll let you dive into that for a few minutes, and we do need to wrap it up in about 10 minutes here.
Okey
So,
dokey.
and there, I want to get into some other points here too, and let me just read some quotes out of your article here before I let you dive into Darwinian militarism. And you say that Wells was certainly no stranger to the bloody Weltanschauung of Darwinism, the budding scribe of scientific romances, studied at the Normal School of Science in South Kensington under Darwin's chief apologist, Thomas Henry Huxley. And then, for instance, in H.G. Wells and the Culminating Ape, Biological Themes and Imaginative Obsessions, literary critic Peter Camp characterizes The Time Machine as a blending of Marx and Darwin. Not surprisingly, The Time Machine presents a future where an ignorant and indolent race called the Eloi luxuriates in a pastoral communist society. And this is what we see, and all of this is also Huxley's Brave New World, which is a Western amalgamation of the Hindu caste system. And he goes on and says, or you go on and say, given the agrarian variety of socialism invoked by Wells, one might discern shades of Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, and absolutely, I 100% agree with that. And then lastly here, the observation brings into clearer focus the dialectical framework intrinsic to the evolutionary theory. The organism thesis comes into conflict with nature antithesis, resulting in a newly enhanced species, synthesis, the culmination of the evolutionary process.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously you have Darwinian. The Darwinian evolution is premised on yet another binary opposition, and none other than Friedrich Nietzsche in The Gay Science characterizes Darwinism as a Hegelian innovation. So you see from which that binary framework to Darwinism comes. It comes from the decidedly Gnostic tradition of Hegel. As a matter of fact, one of Charles Darwin's favorite pieces of literature to read while he was aboard the Beagle was none other than Paradise Lost by, of course, Milton. And Milton's Paradise Lost is marked by this Manichaean cosmology, this Manichaean binaries, heavily Gnostic and everything, and heavily laced with Gnosticism. And you see this, these sort of Manichaean binaries making its way into Darwin's work. The notion of the history of the biological evolution of humanity being a clash between the binary opposition of the fit and the unfit. And of course, H.G. Wells, who, or not H.G. Wells, but T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, aggressively promoted this. And T.H.
T.H. Huxley created the X Club, where he planted 8 professors and universities around
that's right.
the globe to promote Darwin's work. And then the X Club falls into the X-Men and the X-Files and all of this stuff, where they're promoting this idea of super beings over everybody else and all this stuff.
The first real model there for the use of media as the cartelization of media, the control of media. You had the Bathybius Haeckelii scandal. It was discovered that Bathybius Haeckelii was not the missing Monera in the phylogenetic tree
of Ernest Haeckel. It was discovered it was just a lifeless rock. It was gypsum. But the members of the X Club actually worked to suppress that revelation. It was only revealed, I think, in the back pages of 2 journals and everything. But they had to continue to uphold the primacy of the grand narrative of Darwinism.
And we see from Darwin, and when you look at Darwin's so-called theory and what they have today, such as you had the new synthesis and the new synthesis, and then the extended synthesis with Pigliucci and these other guys, but they're constantly having to rewrite the entire theory, but they're still calling it Darwin's theory, even though there's nothing Darwin left in it.
Yeah, it's no longer even remotely similar to what he originally had written. I mean,
now what you're explaining though is how and why they're doing all this, and then Julian Huxley even came up with one of these. I forget which one, the new synthesis, I think.
Right, and the reason being is because they have to uphold this extremely this dialectical narrative to maintain the clash between binary oppositions. Darwinism just represents a biologicized version of that narrative, where now the Gnostic categories of the pneumatic and the hylic, the one who possesses gnosis and the one who simply does not, human and subhuman and everything. Now that's written into genes, and if you look at Darwinism, it really just qualifies as nothing more than a Gnostic myth. It basically dignifies the soteriological claim of self-salvation with this metaphysical claim of self-creation via the theory of abiogenesis and everything. But at any rate, this leads to Darwinian militarism, which is the belief that the laws of evolution are universally applicable even along socio-political contours. And so now we're not just talking about wars among species, we're talking about, on a macrocosmic level, wars among nations. And this is biologically preordained. This is written into the genes of the species. This is what we're meant to do, and all, of course, working towards through this dialectic of history, working towards the man's evolutionary apex, whatever that might be.
Yes, the new utopia for the elite and the Fabians.
It provides the rationalization for the greatest tool that the elite have in terms of social engineering, which is war. Because if you look back at the Carnegie Foundation, way back prior to I believe prior to World War II, they found that there was no better way to induce changes in society than war. That there was no more effective social engineering tool. And I believe that it was John B. Watson, when he was writing about social engineering, he basically said, look, don't be so hard on social engineering. Don't ridicule it. Don't ridicule the employment of social engineering and everything, because it happens all the time. And the greatest example that we have of social engineering is war.
Right. Well, and we also have to look at the entire psychedelic revolution, and Tim Leary and the whole gang of them were out of the Harvard Social Relations Department.
Right.
All right. So let's, and we're pretty much done here, but there's a few points that I want to cover before we wrap it up here that I think are important. And so I'm just going to read off a few of the topics that we have left here that we haven't covered, and let you two sort of touch on them all as quickly as you can, and then we'll wrap it up. Do you know if it was, first off, before I let you go on these, do you know if it was Wells who created the idea of world wars?
The World Set Free certainly seems to present, the Shape of Things to Come. Certainly,
global conflict.
It certainly seems to present one of the earliest models of global conflagration.
Yeah, he he predicts with uncanny accuracy a lot of the events.
Well,
that
I don't know if
result in World War II.
I don't know if he's predicting anything, but it's like Huxley's Brave New World. He's actually the social engineer. He's the architect of the CIA's MK Ultra program, and then everybody's saying, "Oh, well, Huxley is so prophetic." I mean, it gets pretty ridiculous when the guy is actually engineering the whole thing. No, he's not a prophet, folks. He's designing it. As was H.G. Wells.
When you look into this, and especially when you look into the idea of Godonkin experiments taking place through literature and through the use of literature to seed certain ideas, it's hard to determine where do we see predictions and where do we see prescriptions being handed out to elite circles. And in the case of H.G. Wells and all, we most certainly see what should be interpreted as prescriptions being handed out.
And that's exactly correct with Huxley as well. All right, so how did Wells influence? And I'm just going to read these questions off, and you can hit them all. And we'll wrap this up. But how did Wells influence the Manhattan Project? And let's dive into McClure's Magazine and President Truman, and then Pax Universalis sect, and then the Weltanschauung, however you pronounce that. And Rose Martin reveals that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chief centers in Japan of native Christian population. I'd like you to talk about that, as well as the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, which you've kind of briefly touched on, and was the atomic age supposed to usher in a world government, and Robert Oppenheimer and the death of the nation-state system, and then we cannot miss the film The Day After.
Wow. Well,
I know that's a lot, and I'll give you some reminders there. So let's just try and get through this.
Okay,
like 10 minutes. I don't want to go too far over here.
Yeah, let's start with Wells. Okay, we'll just try to build right. We'll just try to go seamlessly
with Wells. Of course, Wells coined the neologism atom bomb in the book "The World Set Free." That was read quite religiously by Leo Szilard, who presided over the Manhattan Project, and the model for the Manhattan Project. This compartmentalized organizational framework where the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing and vice versa, where scientists were working on separate components but could never really correspond with each other on their work. That model was presented in The World Set Free, and Leo Szilard put it to use, tangibly enacted it in the framework of the Manhattan Project itself.
Yeah, and then with the Manhattan Project, we see the cult of the superweapon starting to form, but we also see a rift in the cult of the superweapon. Now, first of all, I gotta say, this cult of the superweapon was not a term that originated with us. It began with H. Bruce Franklin, who is basically kind of a literary critic of more of the left, more of a leftist variety and everything. But it's basically what the cult of the superweapon is. It is not a formal, cohesive group. It's kind of a fetishization of the idea of a superweapon that would basically usher in world peace.
Yeah, a faddish obsession with that, with the superweapon and this pistola upon it of almost eschatological value, because it acts as the means by which history comes to an end. It's immobilized in a state of utopian permanence.
Yes, as the world government is given that instrument of coercion that it needs to impose peace on everybody through the threat of extinction. But we see this splintering of the cult that is represented with two individuals. The first individual is Robert Oppenheimer, and then the second individual is
Edward Teller.
Edward Teller, and everything. There's this argument that breaks out, basically, not necessarily spoken, but what do we do with this weapon? And all. Oppenheimer wants to internationalize the bomb, and he does. And all. He's used, according to Pavel Sadoplatov, to pass nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. This is although Oppenheimer does have sympathies for the Soviet Union, and he does have a socialist background, it's not necessarily because he's pro-Soviet or he's a communist agent. What he is hoping for is to internationalize the bomb, and then by internationalizing the bomb, the world will accept, in his view, he believes that the world will accept a world government as a way of preventing an arms race between the East and the West. Well, we saw how that worked out.
Very bad idea.
Or it's like Huxley warning about the Brave New World while he's engineering the whole thing. And then we see Robert Oppenheimer also at Princeton University for the Institute for Advanced Study. And, of course, key guy behind the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let's not forget about McClure's Magazine and Truman.
Right. Oh, but anyways, with Teller, though, before I go into McClure's Magazine and all, Teller represents the other side, which holds that the bomb needs to stay within the hands of the Americans, and that a unilateral world order should be set up based on an American empire that will eventually morph into a world government with American elites as the primary power holders, and all the other elite
Do you
factions.
want to turn the computer back the other way just a little bit? You're cutting your brother's out of camera there.
Sure.
Other direction.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
There you go.
Okay, with the American elites being the primary power holders and elites in other countries being junior partners or subordinates, and needless to say, that's going to lead to all sorts of factionalism there and all. Edward Teller becomes part of what is known as the Secret Right, which is a constellation of supposedly right-wing groups and everything that includes the Council for National Policy, and the Council for National Policy comes up with a new version of the nuclear eschatology that we see through Tim LaHaye, namely the Left Behind books, where he suggests that a nuclear war is what is necessary, a nuclear holocaust is what is necessary to bring about the second coming. And basically it starts, he uses it to push this fundamentalist understanding of the book of Revelation and of biblical prophecy. But anyways, so that's the two sides that we see of the cult of the superweapon. Robert Oppenheimer representing the Pax Universalis sect, and Teller representing the Pax Americana sect. McClure's Magazine came out with a series of different articles, the Unparalleled Invasion being one of them, where there's this yellow peril, either the Chinese or the Japanese invading the United States, and a super weapon is created that wipes them out and ushers in world peace. These magazine articles not only influenced Truman, but acted as an influence to his whole generation, and probably had a large influence on his final decision to put the bomb to use in Japan, even though it really wasn't needed, and Japan was close to making a peace with the United States.
And then you also said that Nagasaki and Hiroshima were Christian centers.
Yes, absolutely. Basically, those two areas were basically the seat of Christian civilization in the West. I mean, in the East. Sorry, in Japan, and there's always been this kind of there's always been an antithetical nature to the cult of the cult of the super weapon has always been antithetical to the Christian Weltanschauung. So it just seems very, very suspicious then that they would choose these two particular targets and not choose a military installation or a military
Sure.
target.
Well, it seems pretty obvious to me why they did that,
Right, absolutely. But I mean, one of the reasons for this was basically to scare Stalin into any ambitions that he would have in the post-war world, not getting too, so that he wouldn't get too out of hand with any ambitions that he had, or any Soviet ambitions of expansion, because look what we can do to you and everything. So yeah, that's basically what we saw with McClure's magazine, is basically the seeding of the population with these notions of using a super weapon to usher in world peace and to usher in world government.
And of course the embodiment of ontological evil being people of Asiatic descent, which of course you have years and years earlier through pulp fiction, through pulp sci-fi, Asiatic people being depicted pejoratively. Flash Gordon, Ming the Merciless, very Fu Manchu type figure. This constant vilification of people of Asiatic descent,
which now we see with Muslims, etc.
Right, exactly. I mean, and this of course would provide fertile soil for the Southeast Asia campaigns, Korea, Vietnam. It was easier now to depict the enemy as the inhuman other, and that's precisely what they did. We were not fighting Vietnamese. We were fighting, and pardon the racist pejorative, but we were fighting quote unquote goots. That was the mentality. That was the mentality that was promulgated through that sort of fiction. And like you said, nowadays, and I actually wrote an article about that. I don't think there's sufficient time to go into it. But a semiotician, one of my instructors, a semiotician by the name of Elliot Gaines, actually shows in one of his articles, it's a semiotic analysis of Independence Day, where the narrative paradigm of the beleaguered homeworld, the good humans versus the evil aliens, that narrative template was projected via MSNBC, their use of an unverified wire from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, and a intertextual reference used by Ronnie and Xenia to Independence Day. That entire narrative template was projected onto the events of 9/11, whereby the Arab peoples were suddenly depicted as the aliens, the alien other, and humanity was embodied by America and everything. I don't know if I synopsized that very well, but I have an entire article over it, and I would urge the audience to go check out.
Email it to me, and I'll link it to the show notes.
Sure.
So let's go into the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, and if the atomic age was supposed to usher in the world government.
Right. Actually, Robert Oppenheimer comes forward with this proposition that a world government is needed basically to manage these super weapons and to prevent an arms race.
Which that didn't work either.
Yeah. The Baruch Plan comes out in the ashes of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and one of the things that is promoted by the Baruch Plan, which appears to have been heavily influenced by sci-fi and fiction, and that deals with a super weapon. One of the things that it promotes is the creation of a United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, and the plan was really based on a Soviet-American cooperation, but the Russians had a lot of misgivings with the plan, so they didn't cooperate. But what was hoped was that there would be the establishment of an atomic development authority that would basically oversee the development of atomic energy, how it was used, and any nuclear weapons that were produced would be managed by this atomic development authority and everything. And then also the conducting of experiments for peaceful purposes, what that would be escapes me and everything. But that was what the plan was to basically create a supranational entity that was going to manage the bomb and use it to basically impose peace, a very totalitarian peace, upon the population. Things didn't work out as they planned. The best plans of mice and men usually do go off the rails, and all. And the global oligarchical establishment seemed to anticipate the failure of the Baruch plan, no matter how high the hopes were, and began to construct a Cold War dialectic and began to basically use that Cold War dialectic to create nuclear anxiety that would hopefully lead to a world government at some later date. And that's where we get into the day after, because the day after this horrendous nuclear exchange on ABC television and everything that basically had people cleaning out their underpants the very next day.
Yeah, nearly 100 million people watched the movie. It was discussed in classrooms.
I think I was in 6th grade when it came out.
Yeah, what were we, 3rd grade?
Something like that. Either third or second grade. Absolutely horrific thing to see at that age. And what we were viewing at the time was a social engineering project, but we just didn't know it.
Well, if I may, all the events that you see, all these traumatizing images that you see in the day after. All of those images are juxtaposed with one final addendum that renders all of those events almost renders them as inevitabilities. If I recall correctly, it ends with a little title card stating that what we just saw would be, quote unquote, that fateful day. So in other words, this is an inescapable existential reality. And so there was this illusion of this infallibly accurate vision of the future just embedded in the American psyche with that, and the tacit normative message was that whatever one must do in order to avoid this existential reality, if that means the surrendering of national sovereignty, if that means the significant curtailment of one's personal freedom, whatever must be done, and that the juxtaposition of those images with that final title card, it just made it all the more compelling and everything. The message was clear. Either submit or die.
And Jan, you're going to have to look into this, and I encourage the listeners to look into this, and I'll look into this after the program. But I think that ABC, which aired this program, if I recall correctly, I believe it was owned by Capital Cities at the time, which claimed William Casey of the CIA as one of its lawyers and everything. I will have to look into that and all. I do know that Capital Cities had ownership of ABC at one time, and that William Casey was the legal representation for Capital Cities, which is very, very suspicious. Needless to say, all of the day after would go on to play a role in the signing of the Intermediate Range Weapons Agreement in 1986 between Ronald Reagan and the Soviet Union, and it put this country in extreme peril because the Soviet Union did not honor the agreement. Not that we have ever honored any arms agreement ourselves
or any other.
Yeah, it put us in considerable jeopardy as a result.
As a matter of fact, Nicholas Meyer, who was the day after's director,
the Reagan administration told him after the signing of that treaty, they basically told him in a telegram, they said, your movie played no small part in making this occur. So you see where...
Sure. All right. So, and I think we've done a good job today to scale the pyramid and poke the all-seeing eye out. So let's see. I'm just going to wrap up with a quote here from your paper. And you say in your paper, Wells' cult of the superweapon spread like wildfire, mimicking Dostoevsky's Fire in the Minds of Men perfectly. Excuse me. The fire spread to Wells' fellow elitists, engendering them with the underlying devotion that mirrored the most ardent religious fanatic. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up. What do you think?
That says it all.
Yeah,
that says it all.
That says it all. All right, and so that's a wrap, and thank you so much, Paul and Phillip. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure you guys probably want to get back to napping or whatever you want we're doing.
Yeah, gonna go into a coma.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much, and that's it.
Thank you.